Welcome. This is the Contreras Report. I am Raul Lowry Contreras. The state of Virginia this week removed a gigantic bronze statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee from its streets. Some Americans objected. Perhaps the best known is Donald J. Trump. Former President Donald J. Trump is not known for his scholarly background, with his being just another C student in college. Furthermore, he has no roots in America prior to the late 1890s, 1898, I believe. His roots are German and Scottish. Trump can't claim to have U.S. roots such as commentator Pat Buchanan does, whose family produced traitors that committed treason against the United States by making war on the United States in 1861 through 1865, the American Civil War. Buchanan's very proud of them, by the way. So, why did then President Trump veto a congressional act that passed both houses that called for renaming several American military bases that were named for traitors to the United States, traitors that fought against the United States in the Civil War? Thankfully, his veto was overridden by a House vote of 322 to 87, with 109 of those 322 being Republicans voting to override Trump, his veto. The Senate voted 86 to 14 to override, with 37 Republicans voting to override the president's veto. His veto to save Confederate names on bases came because he is ignorant of the real history of the United States that fought the largest war in history up to those years with the largest army in history, the United States Army. The House voted 322 to 87, with 109 Republicans voting to override, and of course 86 to 14 in the Senate, with 36 Republican senators voting to override. Using his historical ignorance, Trump complained publicly the other day about a huge statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee that was moved away from its spot in downtown Richmond, Virginia, the former capital of the rebel insurrection of General Lee. Trump's words of support for Lee, quote, Robert E. Lee chose the other side, parentheses, the South, close parentheses, because of his great love of Virginia, and except for Gettysburg, would have won the war. He should be remembered perhaps as the greatest unifying force after the war was over, ardent in his resolve to bring the North and South together through many means of reconciliation, and imploring his soldiers to do their duty in becoming good citizens of this country, unquote. He obviously didn't write that. Does Trump know something we don't know? Trump, quote, our culture is being destroyed, and our history and heritage, both good and bad, are being extinguished by the radical left. And we can't let that happen. What an embarrassment we are suffering because we don't have the genius of a Robert E. Lee. If Trump ever read real history, these are some words he would have found in prominent places. Quote, soldiers under Lee's command at the Battle of Traitor in 1864, long after the war was decided, I might add, massacred black Union soldiers who tried to surrender. Or he would have found this, quote, during the invasion of Pennsylvania, you will recall that Gettysburg is in Pennsylvania, Lee's army enslaved free black Americans and brought them back to the South as property, unquote. Let's discuss more about Bobbie Lee by using a book by a Mr. Ty Seidule, S-E-I-D-U-L-E, a career U.S. Army veteran. His book, Robert E. Lee and Me. In 30 pages or so, the 40-year-long U.S. Army veteran and emeritus professor of history at West Point presents an airtight case that his childhood hero, the man he believed was the last great man of old Virginia, whom he rated above Jesus, was guilty of treason. Treason is the only crime defined by the Constitution of the United States, so this isn't a mistake. As an officer cadet and then a soldier, Lee had sworn to protect the Constitution, the United States, as had Seidule. Lee's defenders explained his decision to abjure his oath, made 36 hours after being promoted by Abraham Lincoln to the colonelcy, to mail in his resignation from the Army of the United States and hightail it to Virginia as proof of his nobility. His honor prevented him from drawing his sword against his native state, which he also called his country. It was, Sidiel shows, nothing of the kind. First, and here numbers matter, the majority of Southerners at West Point, which Lee had graduated from and which he was commanding at the time, stayed loyal to the United States. Sidiel also argues that we should not use Union because it gets paired with Confederacy and thus elevates a non-state, one founded on slavery, to the level of the legitimate country, the United States of America. Lee's sons followed him, but the majority of his family did not. One cousin served in the U.S. Navy, while his brother, John Fitzgerald Lee, was the U.S. Army's Judge Advocate General. After hearing that Lee prayed for guidance before declaring for the nascent Confederacy, still another cousin said, quote, "I wish he had read over his commission as well as his prayers," unquote. Lee, who was already famous and considered by most, or many, to be the finest officer in the United States had ever produced, could have intervened during the Virginia secession debates in defense of the United States. By choosing not to and then defecting, he abetted and committed treason. The general's defenders, like Trump, point to the end of a paragraph in a letter written in 1856 that Lee wrote, quote, "How long their," meaning blacks, "subjugation may be necessary is known and ordered by a wise, merciful providence." In other words, God tolerated slavery. "Their emancipation will sooner result from the mild and melting influence of Christianity than the storms and tempests of fiery controversy." To argue that deep down the gentleman planter opposed slavery, Lee joined the Southern cause, they argue, because he supported states' rights, because of federal overreach, and that aggrieved Lee's Virginia. But, Sidiel shows, in Lee's eyes, the overreach was Lincoln's legal and constitutionally warranted order to resupply Fort Sumter. The North's action that aggrieved Lee was nothing less than Lincoln's election, partly on the promise to prevent the expansion of slavery to the West. Lee, it turns out, was no different from the Southern fire eaters who proudly proclaimed in their Confederacy's Constitution that it was founded on chattel slavery. How could he be? He owned dozens of slaves. Dozens of slaves. Indeed, he was so committed to slavery that in 1841, when he was superintendent at West Point, Lee ignored New York state laws against slavery and brought a slave named Burke with him to the Army's college. Lee even entered Burke's name on the West Point's pay list. Sidiel goes on, noting how Lee broke up families when he inherited his father-in-law's slaves. During this time, Lee hired the slaves out and, of course, pocketed the money. When his overseer refused to whip Wesley Norris, a slave, and two of his female cousins for escaping, Lee turned to a constable, giving the orders to, quote, "lay it on well," and to pour salt water over the slaves' wounds. Lee responded to the Emancipation Proclamation by writing about how it would lead to pollution, a code for forced miscegenation, and of course, a trope for lascivious African-American males chasing white women, and the destruction, Lee wrote, of our social system. Words that meant the South's peculiar institution, that is, chattel slavery. The book's other chapters are equally forensic and much more personal. Sidiel charts how, from his youth in Alexandria, Virginia, and several moves further south with his parents, through his attendance at Washington and Lee University, and then his military career, part of which was with the 82nd Airborne Division, and finally his tenure as a history professor at West Point, time and again he encountered the myth of the lost cause, and especially Robert E. Lee, aka Bobbie Lee, to the south. His school textbooks might as well have been written by Margaret Mitchell, for they differed not at all from her epic apologia for the South in Gone with the Wind. The Confederacy was crushed, he learned, by a wealthier foe and generals, especially Ulysses S. Grant, who used their larger armies to overwhelm not our general, the South. Slavery, one textbook said, was less onerous in the South than it had been in Africa. Yeah, we heard that every day. Well, they're better off than they would be in Africa. And, quote, the Negroes learned also to enjoy the work, unquote. Not a word of the savage whippings, legal killings, and uncounted rapes of slave women whose bodies were at the service of their masters. We reference Thomas Jefferson in that regard. Only when Cediel turned his research skills on Alexandria's street maps did he discover that scores of north-south streets that immortalized Confederate names were put in place as a response to the civil rights movement in the 1950s. Daily reminders what the most recalcitrant Southerners saw as the ebbing of their glory. Save your Confederate dollars, the South will rise again doesn't make much sense, even then, much less now. Monroe, Georgia, where Cediel's family moved when he was a teen, was the locale of the last mass lynching in America, a fact not commemorated on any of the plaques he saw growing up. Nor was there any mention of the 1890 lynching of Jim Hansen. He had been tied to a log that was thrown into a pond and then shot 85 times. In 1946, U.S. Army Sergeant Isaac Woodward was blinded after nightsticks were driven into his eye sockets. This savage attack led Woody Guthrie, songwriter, to protest in song, and Orson Welles to decry it on his radio show. But in Monroe, Georgia, it was unremarkable. Cediel's older self is embarrassed to tell how, as an undergraduate at Washington and Lee College, he, quite literally, worshipped at Lee's shrine. Lee was buried at the college, and exalted in becoming like Lee, was said to have been a Virginia gentleman. By their very nature, forensic arguments are not emotional. It is to Cediel's credit that in addition to detailing chapter and verse in the case of the U.S. Army, how the names of bases glorify Confederates, Fort Bragg, for example, is named for the Confederate General Braxton Bragg, by the way, who never won a battle. Cediel tells us of all the difficulties he had researching the Army history and the pain it caused him to learn how thoroughly the U.S. Army was inculcated with the myth of the lost cause. You know, the South was right and they were noble. By including the story of law professor Adrian Catherine Wing's visit to Confederate General Pierre G.T. Beauregard's mansion in Louisiana, he all but erases a century and a half between her visit and when, just before the Civil War, Beauregard took 2 slaves with him when he was appointed commandant of West Point. Wing tells how, after she asked a number of difficult questions, the docent leading the tour asked if she had a particular interest in the general. Quote, not exactly. It's the general who has an interest in me, a property interest. For Wing is the great-granddaughter of a slave named Susan Beauregard owned, one of the uncounted hundreds of thousands of slave women who were raped by their masters, including General Beauregard. Nathan M. Greenfield wrote a review of Robert E. Lee and Me, a Southerner's reckoning with the myth of the lost cause, from which some of this material comes from. I suggest Robert E. Lee and Me is a book you should all read. This is Raul Lowry Contreras. Subscribe to this channel and you will be updated whenever there is a new episode of the Contreras Report. You can also send me an email with your questions and I promise to respond. The email address will appear on the screen in a few seconds. Thanks for tuning in. We will see you next time.